Hello and welcome back to Crime on the Clarkfork, the true crime podcast where I tell you about big crimes that happen in small places, with each case occurring in areas with populations of 15,000 or less. My name is Mackenzie Spence and I am your host. It is a stormy day here, so if you hear rumbling or anything like that, it is definitely the thunder that's happening outside, but I needed to get this podcast recorded for you all, so I will edit out most of it if I can in post-recording, but I'm sure there will be times where you might hear it in the background. So if you're wondering what that is, it's a storm that's a-brewing outside. If you listen on Spotify, if you want to turn on those automatic downloads as well as hit the little bell button, you'll get a notification each time an episode goes live. If this is your first time joining, welcome. I'm so excited to have you. Episodes come out every first Sunday of the month. So, I am just going to hop right into this episode for you all. The sources for this episode are Wikipedia, citydata.com, Cody Enterprise, KUSA, Nonstop Local Billings, CBS News, Powell Tribune, ABC News, Gillette News Record, and CNN. Clark, Wyoming, 2013. Population 300. On March 2nd, 2013, a triple murder shook the tiny town of Clark, Wyoming. Clark is technically an unincorporated community and has no town services or central town site, and there are no stores in this community, so technically not a town, but rather an unincorporated community in the state of Wyoming. Most people who live there like to be left alone and tend to work as either farmers, ranchers, or are retired and move to Clark for a quieter life. Because Clark is just 30 miles from the towns of both Cody, Wyoming and Powell, Wyoming, there are a handful of residents that do commute to work in those towns. There is an elementary school in Clark, but by the time students reach middle school and high school, they do have to travel to either Powell, Wyoming, Cody, Wyoming, or Belfry, Montana for school. With only 300 residents in Clark, it's easy to assume that this is a community where everyone knows everybody else, and this is why the triple murder that took place shook the small town and the surrounding areas. On March 2nd, 2013, Tanner Van Pelt and Stephen Hammer, both of whom were teenagers at the time, just 18 and 19 years old, arrived at 38 Big View Road in Clark, Wyoming. The two knocked on the door, and a woman named Ildiko Frietas answered. Stephen knew Ildiko from his childhood, as she and her parents were family friends with Stephen's family, and Stephen started his childhood growing up in the small community of Clark, Wyoming. Ildiko recognized Stephen, so she invited him and Tanner into her house that she shared with her husband, and the three began to have a friendly conversation. 5 days prior, on February 26, 2013, Stephen and Tanner had broken into and robbed Cody Sports and Pawn in Cody, Wyoming. The two got away with 10 different firearms, which included 2 9mm handguns. A few days after the robbery, the teens began to become paranoid that the Cody police were onto them, so they came to the conclusion that they needed to get out of the area, but to do that, they needed a getaway car. That's when they decided to borrow their roommate's Ford Taurus and then drove to Clark. When they made it to Clark, the two stopped at a house and knocked on the door. When no one answered, they got back in their car, went to a different house, knocked on that door, and the owner answered. When the owner of that house answered the door, the two asked for directions. And it isn't reported what directions they were looking for, but authorities really don't believe that the two were lost and are simply glad that the owner of the house wasn't pulled into the murder spree that the teens then went on to have. After this, Tanner and Stephen made it to Ildiko's house. Again, which Stephen knew Ildiko from growing up in the same area. When Ildiko invited them in, the boys told her that the reason that they were there that day was because they needed her Audi sedan to escape to Denver, Colorado, in an attempt to avoid the investigation into the theft of the handguns. Ildiko declined allowing the boys to take her car, which is when they pulled out the 9mm that they had stolen 5 days prior in an attempt to scare her into giving them her car. Ildiko stood her ground, refusing to give the two boys her car, which unfortunately is when the conversation became deadly. Tanner pointed the stolen gun at Ildiko's head, pulled the trigger, and then proceeded to steal the keys to her Audi. It was at this time that the two boys heard a noise downstairs in the house. So, Stephen, with his 9mm, went to go investigate. When he made it to the stairs, he ran into Ildiko's 70-year-old mother, Hildegard. And when he ran into Hildegard, he shot at her 8 times, which is when his gun ran out of bullets. Of those 8 shots, he struck Hildegard 5 separate times, and 2 of which were fatal. Hearing the commotion, Tanner went downstairs, where he also fired additional shots at Hildegard, later stating that he didn't think that she was actually dead yet. Now, we know that this is not true because Hildegard was killed by bullets that Tanner had shot before Stephen had even made it to the scene. After killing Hildegard, Stephen ran to the Taurus that the two had arrived in, and Tanner went into the garage to steal Ildiko's Audi, which, again, is why they were there in the first place. When Tanner entered the garage, he ran into Ildiko's father, Janos Vyoleski. Before Janos could even turn around to look at Tanner, Tanner shot him twice in the back, killing him. Now, Janos and Hildegard did not live in that house with Ildiko, but they did live in another house that was on Ildiko and her husband's property. And the only other person that did live on that property was Ildiko's husband, John, but he was out of town this day, working in the oil fields. After murdering Janos, Tanner hopped into the black Audi and drove off at 11:01 a.m. Both Stephen and Tanner ended up stopping at an irrigation ditch in the town of Clark and disposed of both 9mm that they used in the murders. There was a neighbor who actually kept an eye on traffic that went up and down the dead-end road that the neighbor and Ildiko's home were both on. And because of this, the neighbor had seen the two young men go into the house earlier that day, and then no more than 20 minutes later, saw them speeding off in the 2 separate vehicles as the family's white dog chased them down the road. At 11:27, which is 26 minutes after the two boys left the murder scene, a neighbor went to Ildiko's home to check on the family. This neighbor had actually found their dog wandering around the community of Clark, so they wanted to return the dog and just check in on the family to make sure that they were okay, because this was not something that happened often. When they got to the house, they noticed that the garage door was left open, so they went through the garage door, and unfortunately, they ended up stumbling into the gruesome scene of Janos in the garage, dead on the floor with 2 bullet holes, and this neighbor immediately called 911. Janos was found in the garage, lying in the fetal position, with blood coming out of his mouth. Hildegard was found near the bottom of the stairs and had sustained a bullet wound to her left cheek, and Ildiko was alive, despite the bullet wound in her head. When first responders arrived, they did attempt to save Ildiko, who was moaning in a pool of her own blood. But unfortunately, despite their life-saving efforts, Ildiko did die at the scene. Luckily, the neighbor that had been keeping an eye on the road as they did was able to describe the 2 vehicles that the boys fled in to the police. And it did not take long for Tanner and Stephen to be pulled over at the intersection of Road 1AB and Wyoming Highway 120. The Wyoming Highway Patrol trooper's name was Dan Walker, and he was the one that pulled the boys over at 12:41 p.m. that day. When they got pulled over, Stephen jumped out of the Taurus that he had been driving and got in to the black Audi, Ildiko's car, that Tanner was in. But the boys did quickly surrender after this. They got out of the Audi, laid on the asphalt with their hands up until backup arrived for Walker. When more police officers arrived at the scene, Tanner and Stephen were placed in separate police cars and taken away. Now, Janos and Hildegard did have another child, which was Ildiko's brother, Thomas Vyoleski. And it was incredibly unfortunate that the way he found out about his family's passing was a phone call from the police telling him that they were murdered. And the same thing happened for John, Ildiko's husband, who was working in the oil fields that day away from town. Ildiko grew up in Bakersfield, California, and eventually went to college at the University of Wyoming. After graduating from college, she moved to Clark, Wyoming with her husband John. She had worked as a nurse at West Park Hospital in Cody, Wyoming for a while and had recently left that job because after living in Clark for the last 6 or 7 years at that time, Ildiko and John decided that they were ready to move on. So the two had actually purchased a home in Loveland, Colorado that did need some renovations. So the couple decided to stay in Clark until those renovations were done, and as soon as they were done, they were planning to move to their new home. And this plan to move really was not too long after Ildiko was murdered. Ildiko also loved animals and people, especially her parents, Hildegard and Janos. Now, John and Ildiko did not have any children, but they did have animals together, including goats, a dog, and some birds. Now, Hildegard and Janos were both born in Germany and had immigrated to the United States decades before their murder. When Ildiko and John had moved from California to Clark, Wyoming, Hildegard and Janos also followed the couple so they could be closer to their daughter, but also to escape the hustle and bustle of life that was happening in California. Hildegard, for many that knew her, was known as a woman who was incredibly sweet, a ray of sunshine, and was always laughing, and she was very often seen with Janos, and they were a very loving couple to each other. Janos, Hildegard, and Ildiko were also known to speak to each other in German, which was Janos and Hildegard's native language. And the family was just known in the community of Clark to be very tight-knit and loving. When Stephen and Tanner were arrested, both were questioned by authorities. During this questioning, Stephen waived his right to remain silent and told the authorities that he was, and I quote, "sorry for shooting that lady. We had not planned it to go down this way," end quote. He also told authorities that he wasn't planning on the encounter to get violent, but after Tanner pulled his weapon and shot and killed Ildiko, he didn't know what else to do. He also realized at this time that the authorities most likely knew that the guns that they had used were ones that had been stolen from the pawn shop in Cody not a week earlier. So, due to this, he told investigators that the reason that they needed Ildiko's Audi was because they were trying to flee to Denver because they were afraid they were going to get arrested for theft. Now, the boys were afraid they were going to get arrested for theft, so they went on to go and try and steal a car, murder a family, and then get arrested for murder. So their plan really just was not thought out very well, as is very obvious. During Tanner's questioning, he told investigators about the murders, including the murder of Janos. When the investigator asked for clarification on why he shot Janos in the back, Tanner responded that he shot him in the back twice because he wasn't just going to shoot him in the legs. And that is a direct quote from Tanner. Now, to me, this statement shows that Tanner was out to kill, not just to steal the car. And through the questioning of the boys, authorities managed to also get them to reveal where they had disposed of the two 9mm pistols. The irrigation pipe that they had hidden the guns in was several miles from Ildiko's home. The police also used a search warrant to search Tanner and Stephen's apartment, and it was there that they found the other 8 stolen firearms and some ammunition that was also stolen from that pawn shop. Now, officials are really unsure how Tanner or Stephen knew about the Audi or why they decided to go all the way to Clark to Ildiko's house rather than stealing a car from a neighbor or from one of their family members. And the only tie that they can find between the boys and Ildiko, Hildegard, and Janos was that Stephen knew Ildiko and her family when he was younger and lived in the community of Clark. Tanner's dad, Rob Van Pelt, told the media that at this time Tanner was not living with him, but Tanner had not been in any serious trouble prior to this, which, for Rob, made the news of his son being wanted for murder seem like it was completely out of the blue. Tanner had also never had any serious discipline issues in high school. He graduated in 2011 from Cody High School and really was never involved in any athletics or after school clubs, but was also never in trouble. Now, Stephen had also attended Cody High School, but only his freshman year before he transferred out of the school and moved to California with his parents. Now, even so, the boys had stayed in touch and had remained friends all the way through graduating high school and were then living together in 2013 when this crime took place. A man named Bill Cody also spoke to the media about Tanner and Stephen, stating that he had known the boys for several years and watched them both grow up. He said that he would never have expected for either of them to do something like this. While those that knew them growing up, as well as their families, didn't see this coming, friends and acquaintances of the two teens did tell the media that both boys had been involved with drugs, including meth. So they knew the boys had been in some trouble with drugs, and when they heard of the murders, they didn't expect the boys to be caught for something like that, but they were in some illegal activity prior to the murders. When Tanner and Stephen were arraigned for their crimes, there were more than 30 people there to watch. The charges that the two teens were facing included 11 felonies that included murder, premeditated malice, aiding and abetting, use of a firearm in the commission of a crime, and committing murder during a robbery, just to name a couple. Both boys were appointed a public defender, and as the teens did their pleas, the courtroom was completely silent. Tanner and Stephen didn't speak much during their arraignment, other than to answer the judge's questions, which were mostly answered with yes or no, unless the judge asked for some sort of clarification. They also spent a majority of this time looking down at the floor or at their shoes, rather than at the judge or those in attendance. The judge ordered that the boys be held without bail until they would be able to go to trial due to the severity of the charges against them. Both teens pled not guilty for the 11 felonies before being sent to Park County Detention Center, where they were held until their trials. At their sentencing, Ildiko's brother, Thomas, made a victim impact statement where he stated, and I quote, "That lady you shot was my mother, who was always laughing and kind. She was a 70-year-old woman and no threat to you. Yet you gunned her down like you were playing a video game." End quote. He also stated, and I quote, "How does one even begin to process the news that your loved ones are gone to murder? How could I even begin to take the loss of a loved one and multiply that by 3? My whole family, the only family that I've ever known, just gone." End quote. Both teens cried as they apologized for murdering Ildiko, Janos, and Hildegard. Tanner even went as far to say that he wishes that he could have taken it back and that he hopes he can mentor people in prison. When it was John Frietas, Ildiko's husband's turn, he took the stand to give his victim impact statement. He spoke about how he was not home on the day of the crime and had to find out by a phone call that all of his people were gone. He said, and I quote, "My life is shattered and changed forever. I have an eternity of memories, and what I miss the most is the sound of Ildiko's voice. That's what made my day." End quote. The Park County attorney, Brian Skorick, had agreed to push for life in prison for both of the boys in place of the death sentence, as long as it was okay with law enforcement and the victim's family. Thomas said that he believed that both Tanner and Stephen deserved the death penalty, but them dying would not be something that would bring him closure, so he agreed to life sentences instead. When the boys were given the option to plead guilty for life in prison without the possibility of parole, or plead not guilty and face the possibility of a death sentence, both teens agreed to plead guilty in the murders. In the end, Tanner was given 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, and Stephen was given 1 sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole and 2 additional life sentences. And the reason for the differences in the 2 sentences was because Tanner shot Ildiko, Hildegard, and Janos, whereas Stephen had only shot Hildegard, but he had aided and abetted in the murders of Janos and Ildiko that day. Tanner has since come out stating that he has no explanation for what he and Stephen did that day in March 2013. He stated, and I quote, "But the only thing that I know is that I have to live with it every day." End quote. And he went on further to state that he does wish that he could take it back. Stephen has also come out stating similar thoughts, including the fact that the actions that they took that day could not be justified. He stated, and I quote, "I can't fathom what I've put you and everybody through. I wish, more than anything, I could take back what I've done." End quote. And he stated this directly to the family. In 2014, just 1 year after the murders, Stephen wrote a letter to the sentencing judge asking for a chance at parole, but luckily, this was shut down nearly immediately. And I just have to say, in what world do you think you deserve parole after murdering 3 people in cold blood just to steal a vehicle? Today, both boys are serving their life sentences, and neither one of them has chance for parole. Now, in my opinion, I don't agree with the death penalty solely because, especially in this case, I feel like death can be an easy way out for some of these criminals. I think they should have to sit and rot in prison thinking about what they have done every single day until they die. Now, that's just my opinion, and I know others will have opinions on this as well, but especially in this case, I do think life in prison is going to be so much worse for both of these boys than the death penalty would be. Now, that is the end of this case. I had not heard about these crimes, and they are generally close to home. So, if this is your first time hearing about this case, let me know. Or if you had heard about this case or heard about it in real time in 2013, also let me know your thoughts. As always, please give me 5 stars on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, as well as a review on Apple Podcasts. I am literally always looking for cases to cover, so if you have any suggestions, please visit the link in the show's Instagram at Crime on the Clarkfork. I also post pictures from the cases that I cover on that Instagram page, so go give that a quick follow and let me know what your thoughts are on this case in those comments. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will catch you next time with more big crimes in small places.